I'm Alan Thorpe.
And I'm David Rogers, and together we host the WeatherPod.
In each episode, we invite a leading expert to help investigate how public, private, and academic sectors can work together to produce weather information of value to business and society.
Timely, accurate, and focused weather information and related services have enormous value across all areas of human activity.
It can increase the efficiency and profitability of business, help save lives and improve safety on land, at sea and in the air, and predict the spread of life-threatening diseases.
Now, as climate change increases the frequency and impact of extreme weather events, weather information is crucial to build social and economic resilience. Hello, and welcome to the WeatherPod. Copernicus is the European Union's Earth observation programme, which is implemented in partnership with the European Space Agency, the European Organisation for the Exploitation of Meteorological Satellites, the European Centre for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts, EU agencies, and Mercator OCM. Vast amounts of global data from satellites and ground-based, airborne, and seaborne measurement systems provide information to help service providers, public authorities, and other international organisations improve European citizens' quality of life and beyond. The information services provided are free and openly accessible to users. One of these services is the Copernicus Climate Change Service, or C3S, which supports society by providing authoritative information about the past, present, and future climate in Europe and the rest of the world. The C3S mission is to support adaptation and mitigation policies of the EU by providing consistent and authoritative information about climate change. It offers free and open access to climate data and tools based on the best available science. The service is implemented on behalf of the EU by ECMWF. C3's director is Dr. Carlo Buentempo. Carlo's professional interests include climate projections, monthly to decadal forecasting, climate impacts, regional climate modelling, global climate change, and science communication. Prior to joining ECMWF, he was manager of the Climate Services team at the Met Office Hadley Centre in the UK. Welcome to the WeatherPod, Carlo.
Carlo, it's a particular pleasure for me to welcome you to the WeatherPod, actually, because as you may know, I was Director General of ECMWF when the very first C3S contract with the European Union was agreed. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about the latest developments now the service is well established. So welcome, Carlo.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure for me to be here with you today.
So if we can start, our viewers and listeners, particularly outside of Europe, may not be so familiar with the Copernicus programme. So Carlo, perhaps you could give us a brief outline of its history and its purpose.
Yes, certainly. So the Copernicus program is the Earth observation program of the European Union. So the main purpose is really to look after the satellite mission, designing the mission, launching the satellite, retrieving the data. But the program can be broadly divided into two parts: the space component that really looks after the satellite platform, and the service component. So the idea is that it's not enough to launch a satellite to take the full value out of it, but you want to really extract that information, the added value, through thematic services. So Copernicus is structured over 6 thematic services covering the marine, the land, the security, the emergency, the air quality, and climate change. The climate change service being the most recent of the services to be established. Each service is run on behalf of the Commission, on behalf of the European Union, by entrusted entities. So, for instance, the emergency management service is run by the Joint Research Centre of the European Commission. The marine service is entrusted to Mercator OCM, and both the atmospheric monitoring service and the climate change service are implemented on behalf of the Commission by the European Centre for Medium-Range Weather Forecast, or ECMWF. So the plan of the activities of each service is described in an agreement with the Commission that runs typically 7 years. But on a quarterly and a yearly basis, what is being implemented, what is being described, what's happening in the program is presented back to the member states, so to all the member states of the EU plus the cooperating state in the Copernicus program.
Carlo, I was lucky enough to travel to Europe's spaceport at Kourou in French Guiana to see the launch of the very first Copernicus satellite, Sentinel-1. Really spectacular. So a really exciting program of satellites and services.
So, Carlo, you mentioned C3S is implemented by ECMWF. What's the mission of C3S, and how does it connect with the rest of ECMWF's activities?
Well, the main mission, as I see it, is really to make the huge amount of data and climate information that exists accessible freely and openly to anyone. So this is part of our contribution to the transformation that our society needs to make in order to become greener, if you want to use an often abused expression. But in that transformation, we need to change the way in which we look at climate risk. And in that transformation, we require a lot of data about the past, the present, and the future climate. So the portfolio of C3S really covers all these aspects, going from the historical observation, this being ground-based or satellite, through the reanalysis, which is the rerun of the weather prediction model that we use day in, day out to make weather prediction over the historical period, so that we can characterize the weather of any place of the planet from 1940s till 5 days ago at hourly resolution, but also the seasonal prediction, what's going to happen in the next 6 months, or what might happen over the next 5 years or 10 years, all the way through the climate projections. So these are the farthest away from the observation that typically look at from present towards the end of the century. So all of this is put together on a same platform, looking after the different format and facilitating really the interoperability of these data sources, and then provided in an operational fashion, because the Copernicus program is not a research program, builds upon a research program, but is very much an operational program. So all this is delivered to the many users we have all over the world. So that's the core mission. That's what we do day in, day out. And this links very strongly to the core activities of ECMWF, because the European Centre for Medium-Range Weather Forecast was established in the 70s to tackle those problems that the single country could not tackle on their own, especially looking at the medium-range forecast week 2 and thereabout. So it became a center of excellence for weather prediction. And one of the key elements in that transformation has been the ability to look at the observation, mostly satellite observation, and assimilate those observations into the weather prediction model. And that skill set, that expertise, the expertise required to do this big step forward in weather prediction, then become very relevant, directly relevant to the monitoring of the climate system. So I was talking about the reanalysis, rerun of the weather prediction model. Those reanalyses are at present the key element of our portfolio, the most significant data set in terms of volume of data download and number of users, accounting for more than 50% of our over 170,000 users registered in the system.
I'm interested, Carlo, just to backtrack a little bit on the idea of a climate service. I think this phrase, climate services, emerged relatively recently. And of course, we're used to the idea of a national meteorological service providing a weather service. So we're used to perhaps understanding the term weather service. And I'm sort of wondering about what the distinction is between a weather service on the one hand and a climate service on the other. Is it just that it's really how far into the future we're trying to predict? Climate services is longer time range, or are there other key distinctions that differentiate a weather service and a climate service?
That's a very, very interesting question and offers several points of reflection. I guess from a user point of view, there is really not such a distinction. It's a continuum. You look at the historical observation, you look at the weather prediction, and then you'll also put those in the context of a changing climate. I guess it becomes, I mean, climate service up to a certain extent has existed throughout history. And we have been doing climate services for much more than the last 20 years. But within the last 20 years, climate service has become a societal necessity. And this came for me after the realization that climate was changing and that humans were mostly responsible for a significant fraction of the changes that we were observing. So this, I mean, each one of us may have a slightly different definition on where that transformation took place, but certainly around the turn of the century, I think that became a bit of a turning point. Until then, climate science was mostly that science and was having some branch into application, but quite marginal. Some specific sector, maybe like energy or water-related sector, were a bit ahead of the game in using the technology and the information coming from climate. But since then, I think we have seen a significant shift in the audience and an increase in the interest for the information for climate services. And there are sectors, I mean, if you look at finance, for instance, finance, I think, is a good example. At the turn of the century, finance was not very much interested in climate information. And nowadays, especially in Europe, the banking sector is very active in engaging with climate data, not just climate information in general, but really climate data, because there's been a shift in regulation. There are some necessity in terms of investment to put alongside any investment information about the risk of that investment. And part of that risk is also the climate component. So if you look at frameworks such as the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, then there are clear requirements in terms of the disclosing the assumption and the risk of specific investment. So that's just an example. And similar example can be made for any other sector, from agriculture to hydrology, from energy to transport. They are all becoming more interested in analyzing their climate risk profile and how this may change over time. And now, I think that's the bulk of the proposition. And interestingly, while clearly, as you were mentioning, Alan, the climate change timescale, so the projection timescale is probably one of the important distinctions. But any climate change risk analysis starts from an analysis of the current risk. So analyzing, starting from observation and reanalysis, analyzing the current level of risk is the starting point. And so we see that that's one of the key value added that the service offers to the community of users.
So related to that, do you see, I mean, obviously C3S is providing a service to anybody, and you've discussed that. Do you see it being kind of embedded in some meteorological services, that they're actually using it as a tool for them to then deliver services themselves, or is it really just direct C3S to the user rather than to another meteorological service?
Yeah, I think there's been a bit of an evolution in that respect. When I joined C3S, I was responsible for a specific part of the program, that is the sectoral information system. And the idea of that was really to bridge the gap with a specific sector and deliver information that was relevant to that sector. But since then, I think we stepped back a bit, because we really see the value in intermediaries, so to speak, that are closer to the end users, and this being industries or public sectors. They take the information and the data we make available, freely available, and in such a way that can be reused for any sort of application. Take that as a starting point, and then they add value through a variety of means. Add values by increasing the resolution, or enriching with additional data sources, or meshing up the climate information with information on socioeconomic or vulnerability or the like. But also add value by transforming that data into something that is more directly relevant to the users that they deal with. And that last mile, that connection is really where most of the value is being added. And that's more difficult to mainstream or to generalize. So a programs such as Copernicus, I think, is very well suited to do the work behind to ensure that the transformation from a more research academic environment into operational product take place. But upon that platform, then many actors can build and deliver their value-added service. And that's the model we are following, also very closely working with the National Met Services. And we have seen a shift in many Met Services from being a bit dubious about C3S, and for sure, Alan remembers the discussion with some of the member states were not necessarily all supportive of the effort. And I think in the space of a few years, this has changed because they have seen the value that a program such as C3S can offer also to them.
So, Carlo, you obviously have a great passion for this. So when did you actually take up your role as director, and what attracted you to the role?
Well, interestingly, I was working at the Met Office at the Hadley Centre at that time, and I was working on climate services. So my job was really to understand or define the question with the users, because that's, I think, in this last mile is the most important element. It's not to go there with a solution, but it's really to listen and understand what is their issue, what is their critical point, and then transform that issue into something that you can deal with in terms of climate data. So that was part of my job, understanding the context, understanding the question from the user. And the other part of my job was then to reach out to find the data sources, aggregate them, transform the different formats, and generate a data set or indicators or a report that was fit for purpose, that was answering or addressing the question. And in that process, this disparity of data sources, of format, of projections, was part of the difficulty, was another layer of complexity. So when C3S came about, I really felt it was a game changer, because it was, for the first time, there was an international program devoted to simplify that interface and transform that provision of data from something a bit ad hoc and research-based into something coherent and operationally built. So that was extremely interesting from my point of view, and I really felt that I needed to be part of it. That's why I decided to join the program.
You're listening to WeatherPod with Alan Thorpe and David Rogers.
If I could, we've talked a little bit already about this, but I wanted to just pick up a bit more about the interactions of C3S with actually the public, private and academic sectors. David and I often talk about the Global Weather Enterprise as this wonderful consortium between all three of those sectors. And C3S as a public sector organisation, as you've already hinted, has links to the academic sector in various ways, and the private sector. Could you just say a little bit more about how those links work? How do you actually interact with those type of organisations?
Absolutely. So I guess the first point to stress is that, as I mentioned before, C3S is not a research project or program. It's really building upon research, but the goal is not to write yet another paper. Obviously we do, and some of them are also highly cited, but it's not our goal per se. Our goal is to set up, maintain, run, and eventually expand an operational service. So that's our read. But in order to maintain that cutting-edge nature of the program, then we need to link with research. We need to be sure that what we do is based on good quality science and up-to-date research. So we always have a very close link with a national and international European program, research program, this being the Horizon Europe or Horizon 2020 before those at the European level, but also a national program in the different member states. We link with those either by being partner in this program. This is something more recent, because before we we're not partner in this program, and more often than not being in the advisory board or shaping some of the research goal to ensure that the next generation of project actually develops science in a direction that is relevant to the service. So that's the natural link with academia. But it's not just academia, it really is global, how did you call it? Global entrepreneurship or
global weather enterprise.
Global weather enterprise. In this global weather enterprise, global climate weather enterprise, the private sector is very important. And we engage with the private sector in several ways. Well, private and public sector, it doesn't necessarily be only private, but in this enterprise sector, let's say. So on the one hand, one aspect to stress is that the program as such is not just run by ECMWF. So there is a core team of people within ECMWF who set up and run the program, but a significant fraction of the budget is actually given out in contract. So the program itself is implemented by a partnership between ECMWF and many institutions, research institutions, national Met services, private sector enterprises, small and medium enterprises, and so on. So that's one close link, because it's also a link that allows us to really feel the pulse of what the market is working on and what the priority of the market are. But the other element for me is the user, who the users of the information and tools that we put together are. And there is no barrier, so the data can be seen and accessed by anyone. We only ask a very light touch registration to the users so that we have an idea of who the users are and where they are located. And looking at those statistics, we know that for some data set, the fraction of private sector users or public sector users, but non-academic user, is very significant. So if you look at, for instance, the seasonal predictions, then we have a great interest from the private sector in seasonal prediction. If you look at the sectoral indicators for energy or for health, for instance, again, there is a significant fraction of our users that self-identify themselves as being from the private sector or from the public sector, but not academic. So people who are using the data for business or to inform decision and policies rather than to look at, to write the next paper, let's say. So, and for me, that fraction is a fraction I always look when I get a weekly statistic of who is, the different users. That's for me is almost a badge of honor. The fact that the fraction goes up, it means that what we are doing is relevant, and especially I think that the private sector is particularly important because they wouldn't use our data if you weren't useful. So,
if I could just follow up, that's interesting. To come back to what I was talking about earlier about the distinction between a weather service and a climate service, it just struck me that, of course, in the case of weather services, there is a highly competitive market of providers of weather services, not only the National Meteorological Services, but also many private sector companies that provide weather services to the end user, so to speak. And it's a very, in a sense, it's a very competitive market. So I'm sort of wondering, trying now to draw the analogy to the climate services. Do you see the same thing happening with climate services? In a sense, we've talked about C3S, but do you have competitors? Are there other climate services that are going to come into the market and to, in a sense, compete with you?
It's a very good answer. It's a very good question, and I think it has a complex answer because if you look back, there's been a lot of discussion about this emerging climate service market, and has always looked like a slow starter. It's almost there, but never takes off. I feel that things are changing much more rapidly of the last few years, and what I was referring to before for the financial sector, for me, is a good example. When you start involving this big player, then the market almost develop overnight because there is really a requirement, there is a need. And so I think we are seeing that. There is one element that makes an important distinction, and is, for me, the nature of of the data. So one of the reasons the weather forecast or the weather market is so dynamic is also because there is a product that is constantly updated, and it's the weather forecast. So that space is incredibly competitive and is relatively easy to verify. You can say my model is better than your model, or my system is better than your system, and these are the scores, or you can calculate the score yourself. When you get into climate, then the assessment of the value becomes more challenging, and this constant update cycle that we have in weather forecast is less stringent. So, if you look at the climate projections, up until now at least, they've been mostly updated in accordance to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change cycle, so 7 years cycle or thereabout, so quite slow. And until you get the next generation of projection, the picture doesn't change that dramatically, meaning that market is a bit slower. And if you look at the historical data, that's also partly true. Once you have a solid understanding of your baseline risk, the fact that you have an extra few points or an extra few years or a slightly higher resolution, may be a differentiator, but it's not that much of a differentiator. So for me, there are two areas where the market is developing now that are interesting. One is this recent past. I was mentioning the reanalysis running up to 5 days ago. That's very close to present, and having a global vision of what the weather was 5 days ago, and possibly even less. There is not technical reason. There are some operational reasons, but there are not technical reason why that couldn't be brought to 2 days ago or even a day ago. That actually is important, because if you have an up-to-date snapshot of the status of the atmosphere and the ocean, very recent one, then you can initialize your impact model. You can initialize your agricultural productivity model, your hydrological model, your coastal water quality model, and so on and so forth. So that's a space of competitiveness, and not only at the global level, but also at the regional and local level, because our global model at the moment is running at 30 kilometers. We are pushing it to lower that resolution, or to increase the resolution to something between 10 and 20. But still, for many impact assessment, then you want higher resolution, and there are a plethora of ways in which you can go from 20 kilometers to 500 meters. And so that's a competitive space. The other element is on the other side of present. So this was near past. I think the other element is near future. So not the weather prediction, because that's out of our remit, but sub-seasonal and then seasonal prediction. That's another space where you can make predictions. They are verifiable, and there is a growing interest from the users, so non-research users. And the fact that the seasonal predictions are often the single data set on our catalog, which has the highest fraction of private sector user, I think is a testimony of that interest. And the energy market in Europe this winter was very interested in the seasonal prediction, understanding whether the gas demand was going to increase or not, also for political reason or geopolitical reason. So that kind of information.
Yeah. So you're giving the impression, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that the market is actually ripe for the private sector to enter, to provide specific tailored or specific services in addition to what's produced by C3S.
Yeah, and in some cases we are very aware of this existing already, and every time we find a new one of these actors, we happily invite them to our General Assembly and engage with them to ensure that what we are doing is fit for purpose, that they are happy with our product, or if they have suggestions, we're happy to listen to their suggestions so that we can improve our product. I know I made many references today to energy sector, but let me allow to make another one. But if you look at the wind resources, and there is these are the sector of renewable energy, and in particular wind is a heavy user of our data and there are commercial enterprises operating in that space for siting of new wind farm, for instance. You want to have to find the best possible location to have a good return on investment. And the International Renewable Energy Agency, that is based in Bonn, has actually used our data to make a very nice calculation of where it would be best to install wind and solar farm in Africa to maximize the production, and so to meet the growing need for energy of the continent. And in doing that, I think that's a very nice example of how the climatological information can be mashed up with other sources of data about socioeconomic, about infrastructure, because that calculation, so finding out what are the optimal locations, is not just driven by weather or by climate, is driven by existing infrastructure, access to or distance to villages and cities, and so on and so forth. That's the kind of...
Yeah, so it's a lot less sort of competition with you as a provider of a service. It's more of your enabler of a very vibrant, competitive market for sort of downstream of you. And maybe that's a distinction between what we see at the weather scale, where there's, in a way, somewhat unnecessary competition at times for the same product, as opposed to developing new products and services downstream of the provider. I mean, we hear often, somebody wants to do a better job than ECMWF on the weather dimensions, and claim to do so, and that seems always a bit bogus, to say the least. But in this case, there's less of this idea of competing with you. You're providing freely available data. You're providing freely data that is enabling a lot of downstream products to be developed and utilized, as you've described.
Yeah, I think there are some differences, but there are also some analogies, because also in the weather, I know of some of the claims about the competition with the global producing center, but in a sense, you can imagine the big center producing global forecast as being enabler of the downstream market. So a lot of the private sector operators and enterprises operating in the weather world actually do their job starting from information coming from one or more of the global producing center of weather predictions. So in that sense, I think that there is a similarity, because similar to that, also for the climate change service, or for the climate change proposition, there is a need for an investment in the generation of the information as a starting point, and over that initial proposition, then private or public sector enterprises can build their solution.
I guess in that context, it's worth noting that, I mean, one of your key data provision data sources, if you like, data sets, is the ERA 5 reanalysis, and that is, I mean, that's a really expensive thing to generate and to produce. And it's great that a public sector organisation like ECMWF creates that data set from which a lot of things can be developed, a lot of services and products. But it will be very difficult, for example, for a private sector company to get in the business of producing a better reanalysis, because it is such a major computational expensive task in and of itself. Would you agree with that, Carlo?
Yeah, I would completely. I think it goes exactly in the direction I was mentioning. There is a need for that initial investment, in this case often from a public sector organization such as ECMWF, to generate that data set. That data set requires typically a couple of years of integration on our supercomputer. So it's a very significant investment, and probably an investment that many private sector companies wouldn't be prepared to do it upfront. And it also builds upon, it's not just the investment of running the system, it's also the investment over the years of generating a model that is able to reproduce the weather globally to a high level of accuracy and maintain the data simulation system. So there is a lot of background IPR, if you want, in that model. It's not just the integration of the supercomputer time that matters there.
You're listening to WeatherPod with Alan Thorpe and David Rogers.
That leads quite nicely to the next question. As you know, Carlo, much of our interest on the WeatherPod, which is supported by the World Bank, is how advances in science and technology can help low and middle income countries deal with the impacts of weather and climate change on business and society. And I'm really curious to know how we basically can use C3S outside of Europe, and how it could be used more effectively by development partners such as the World Bank.
Yeah, and that's a very good question. And in a sense, the first point to stress is that even now, C3S is used widely, not just in Europe. So if you look at the statistic, and they are available on the website if you're interested, there is a live page. You have to follow the live link that gets you to a page where there are information about where the users are and what is the current data download volume. And if you look at that page, you realize that Europe is often one of the region that has the highest number of users or the highest download, but it's not the only one, and it's not always the top one. Southeast Asia is another region that is very heavily represented in our ranking, as it is North America and some part of Africa. So in a sense, we are already reaching out, and South America, we are reaching out to communities well beyond Europe. I like to think that there is an intrinsic advantage for countries, in the global South, in the proposition of C3S, because one of the limiting factors has often been the bandwidth to access the data. So Alan was mentioning the reanalysis. So ERA 5 at present is around 10 petabyte of data. So that's a huge amount of data. It's a phenomenal amount of data. It's a billion, 10 to the 15 byte, or if you like music, if you were an MP3, would be an MP3 running from the end of the last ice age, a terabyte. So very large amount of data, right? And if you are interested in knowing what was the maximum wind in your little island in the middle of the ocean, then in the absence of a better way of handling that information, you will need to take all that amount of data, extracting the U and the V components, so east, west, north, south component of the wind, do the sum of the square, and then take a square root of it to get the wind speed. That's a lot of operation for something that is actually quite small. So the result you need at the end is really quite small. So if we can create, as we did, an infrastructure that does all that manipulation close to where the data sits, then you can retrieve your information as a wind speed in your little islands directly, and that requires much smaller bandwidth. So the fact that you are in a developed nation with a fiber optics, or in the middle of a desert with a flaky internet connection, doesn't prevent you from accessing that information. So I think that's a natural intrinsic advantage of the approach.
That stimulates yet another idea in my mind about the distinction between weather and climate services. I mean, it would be wrong to say that it's only ECMWF that has created a reanalysis data set, for example, and there are several, not many, but there are several reanalysis data sets that are primed for the sort of climate change service products that you've been talking about. And of course, as we also know, there's a lot of interest from the artificial intelligence machine learning community that kind of data set is also important, could be important for new ways to predict the weather, never mind climate. So it strikes me again that we need to think a little bit about the international collective effort in producing these huge data sets like reanalysis, and try to avoid, if you like, needless duplication, where obviously you need to be a significant size player to get into this game, but nonetheless, do we need 50 different reanalyses, global reanalyses, to drive these kinds of services? And you can make the same comment about weather forecasting, of course, as well. So it's just something maybe not a question, just a reflection from me, but I hope that internationally we can come together to maximize the use collectively of the computational resource that's there. And this can be quite difficult because there is national pride. There is, governments want to see their own country taking a leading role. So it's quite a difficult and complex organizational and political question. I don't know if you have any reflections on that, but just strikes me from what you've been saying as something we need to think about in the future.
No, I think you're absolutely right. We need to look into all ways we can to avoid duplication, knowing that it might be possibly impossible to avoid it completely, but maybe finding a level at which that multiplicity of actors actually add value. Because, comparing our reanalysis with the reanalysis coming from Japan or North America, for instance, actually can be quite useful. It can be a way of understanding the limitation of different approaches, exploring different approaches in the first place, and learn in the process. So maybe the solution is not necessarily just one global reanalysis, but close coordination of effort on reanalysis. I'm talking about reanalysis, but the same argument can be made in other areas as well. Is maintain that visibility and coordination and cooperation with other entities. And I think that there has been a lot of development there. There's certainly a lot of communication on reanalysis. We had a conference, and now coming next year, the ECMWF seminar series would be focusing on reanalysis. So these are opportunities to build those linkages and to ensure that that coordination exists and we are working in the same direction. The other point you make, and I think this opens another reflection, and I think it's a very interesting one, is this new role that artificial intelligence and machine learning is playing. So this is something that I think we should be looking into much more carefully than we had over the last few years, because it can be a significant game changer. And it's not obvious that we are already building era 6 and looking into plan for era 7. But at some point, as we have done for weather prediction, I think it would be important to see which part of the equation, which part of the system can actually be changed or adapted to take advantage of the development in machine learning. Because in some part, as in the radiative transfer, for instance, that's the part of the code that deals with the radiation coming from the sun and re-emerging from the atmosphere and the ocean and the land surface. That part of the code is already one area where application of machine learning are being exploited, and there might be many others. The entire approach of the analysis may change in the future. So I think we need to keep our eyes open and be very ready, very prepared to change the approach when required.
You're listening to WeatherPod with Alan Thorpe and David Rogers.
Carlo, at the moment there's considerable interest in general in the impacts of climate change, and right now there's a growing interest in what to do about the increasing risk of heat waves. And I'd like, perhaps it'll help our audience to understand how the service can be used if we look at a very specific example. How are we using C3S as a service that will help support our understanding of particularly urban heat waves? How is the system used? How is the service used?
Okay, so let me divide the answer into two parts. One part is about the data set we have, and the other is in the direction of application or solution to address a specific problem. So if we start from the data set, then the portfolio of C3S is really structured on a logical time structure. So you have observation of the past. So some of those goes back to the late 19th century, and the effort there is trying to make all these observation, surface observation, ocean observation, over land and so on, available to everyone. But also reprocess and transform the information that comes from satellite into something that can be used. And to do that, we use the concept of essential climate variables, This is a concept of the GCOS, the Global Climate Observing System. And there's a list of 54 variables describing the climate system. And of these 54, we have 22 for which we have a climate data record. So some of this climate data record may be directly relevant to the heat waves, such as humidity or surface temperature or the like. Then we have the reanalysis, and we discussed about the reanalysis in this pod today. So this reconstruction of the past weather. And this is essential, for instance, if you want to analyze the risk of heat waves, because it gives you a description on any place of the planet of the weather of the past. So if you want to see, for instance, in a specific location, what is the percentage of time that that location is above a certain temperature threshold, or whether this frequency has changed over time, then you want to have this homogeneous time series as much as possible, extending as far back in time as possible. Then if you move next, then I guess what you are interested in for heat wave is to understand whether the risk in this specific year is higher or usual or higher or lower than usual. And in that sense, using the seasonal prediction, which are part of the portfolio, is also could be very useful. You know that, for instance, in El Niño year, and we are very likely to see one within the next 12 to 24 months. In a El Niño year, global temperature are higher, and some region of the world see a higher risk of heat wave as a consequence of that. So having that information beforehand can allow us to prepare better and respond with action on the ground. And then finally, the climate projection, which are also part of the portfolio, both the global projection and the regional projection allow any user to really see how that risk in the case of the heat wave may evolve over time. So, for instance, we have data set looking at the changes in heat wave risk in the projection over Europe, in this case, city by city, where you can see how much more frequent a certain kind of heat wave may become. So this is about the data set. Alongside the data set in the proposition of C3S, there is also this concept of applications. So there is a certain amount of cloud computing that is available for free for people to use. And this cloud computing layer is used to really transform the data into something that is more meaningful. So it's not just having a data set that is archived and can be interrogated, but maybe generating an index or generating a variable that is of interest of a specific community. So it's possible to write a small script to generate that index on the fly and generate the output. And there are some applications that have been designed already by us for the user to use. Some of these applications go exactly in the direction of heat wave. So there are specific applications, again, mostly focusing on Europe, but just because of the geographical scope of the program, but can be extended easily to other parts of the globe, looking at how specific risk evolve over time and generating maps or XY plots or something else altogether. So this is, in a nutshell, some of the ways in which the heat wave risk can be seen through the lens of the program.
Thank you.
Great. Well, I think we've probably come to the end of our discussion today. And Carlo, it just remains for me to thank you very much for joining us on the WeatherPod and sharing your considerable insights into climate services, and in particular the Copernicus Climate Change Service. I think it's become clear to a lot of people that it's a very valuable resource worldwide, and I hope that it will continue to be as successful as it has been recently.
And I hope that those in our audience who didn't know much about the Copernicus program now have a better idea of its value, and particularly through C3S to decision makers, coping with climate change. Also, I just note that when we put this on our website, that we'll provide additional links to online material so that people who aren't exactly sure where to go for this week will actually have really some direct links to the key parts of the service. And thank you again, Carlo, for joining us today.
Well, thank you both. Thank you, Alan and David, for this lovely conversation. And the good thing of Copernicus is that it also has a very simple URL, which is climate.copernicus.eu. So if you don't find your link in the WeatherPod or you struggle to find it, you can always follow this link. Thank you very much.
Well, that concludes this episode of the WeatherPod. We hope you've enjoyed it. Alan and I will be back next month, and in the meantime, please give us your feedback via email to support@gweforum.org.